Welcome everybody to tonight. We are happy to host Dr. Rosemarie Allen for our conversation on race in America. Okay, I'm just going to give a brief biography for Dr. Allen. Rosemarie Allen has served as a leader in early childhood education for nearly 40 years. Her life's work is centered on ensuring children have access to high quality early childhood programs that are developmentally and culturally appropriate. She is currently an associate professor in the School of Education at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. She is president and CEO of the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence, which serves as the lead agency for ensuring equity in educational practices throughout the nation. Just before we start, I do want to take us through our functions for Zoom. We have a chat box that you can use to make any comments to our panelists or ask any questions. We are keeping an eye on that for Dr. Allen. It's a simple enough to use function. Just type in, you have permission to talk with the panelists. We also have a Q&A function. If you have a question, ask it in the Q&A form. This saves it for us so that we can get back to you before the end of the presentation or as we go along. And finally, we do have simultaneous interpretation going on. You'll see a gridded globe icon on the bottom left of your Zoom options, or bottom right, excuse me. And you can choose to leave it off, choose English for your channel or Spanish. If you have any questions about any of the technicalities in Zoom, you can ask us in the chat as well. We'll be happy to help you with that. And with all that, we are ready to begin. I will go ahead and give the floor over to Dr. Rosemarie Allen.
Thank you so much, Alex. I am so excited to be here, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy lives on a
vidas muy ocupadas en la
come and have this discussion. I know some of you work and some of you are home with children, and this is right at dinner time and everything else that we have to do. And you took the time out to be here. So I want to thank you for that. I'm going to jump right in. I have a lot of information to share, but it's really, really important that we just establish some community norms. And I only have two, and they are, this is a safe space. This place is safe. And the other is that we allow each other the space and grace to grow. Conversations about race and equity, they can be very, very scary. I guarantee you're going to make mistakes. You're going to trip and you're going to fall and you're going to say the wrong thing and use the wrong pronoun and all of that. I just made a big mistake with misgendering someone on Monday, as long as I've been in this work. So we have to allow each other the space and grace to grow. The other is some basic understandings and assumptions. We're a mess right now when it comes to race relations, and we know that. But the reality is, we didn't create the mess. I had someone say to me, you know, Rosemarie, I've never, ever, ever in my whole life owned a slave. And I said, that's pretty awesome. And I've never, ever in my whole life been one. You didn't own a slave. I wasn't one. But here we are, and we find ourselves picking up the residual impacts of this. So we didn't create it. So we don't blame or shame each other. But even though we didn't create it, we have a personal and professional responsibility to clean it up. We have to do something so that our children and our grandchildren won't inherit this. But where you are is okay. Where you are is okay. But once you learn more, do more. Once you know better, do better. So that's all I'm asking. So I have a question for you. Just an informal poll. You could put yes or no in the chat box. How comfortable are you talking about race and equity? So I feel comfortable talking about race and equity. Just put yes or no in the chat box. Let me get a feel for where you are. Yes, okay. Yes, I see a couple of yeses. Kinda, thank you, yes. You know, it's really interesting because race is one of those topics that we've not been taught to talk about. People of color talk about race quite often because it's so connected to our survival, but white people haven't had to. And many times you're raised to be colorblind, not to notice race, to say, I don't see race, I just see people. But we know that's not true because guess what? When you logged on and you saw my face, you knew I was Black. And guess what? That's perfectly okay. It is okay to notice because I want you to. I want to be seen in all my uniqueness and for who I am. Just don't treat me differently in a negative way because of it. That's the key. So first, because I am a teacher, I am a professor, I'm always giving definitions. So let's just get on the same page so we know what we're talking about when we talk about equality, equity, and justice. So here's a graphic of inequality. And this is unequal access to opportunities. Here, this little person over here that you could barely see in blue, they don't have very many apples in their tree and it's leaning to the little person on the right. So this is inequality. And then you say, let's fix this. This isn't right. They need ladders. So equality is when we give the exact same tools, evenly distributed tools and assistance. You know, I actually saw this happen in my family. My mother was born disabled. Her right arm was twisted in a ball, and so was her foot. And she had epilepsy, so she couldn't drive. But every single time when they were younger, she and her brother, every time my grandfather bought her brother a new car, they bought my mother a new car. Equal. My mother couldn't drive. So that gave him 2 new cars to drive. And it just actually made no sense, but they were determined to treat them equally. So that's equal. But you see, that still doesn't work because they have the same ladders, but the tree is still bent to this little person's favor and he still can't reach. So then we think that's not working. Equality is not working. Let's try equity. So equity is giving to each person according to their needs. How do we support you? The tools are customized that identify and address inequality. So it's like, well, this person's tree is lower, but this person, they need a taller ladder. And we can say, wow, that really fixed it. But did it? Not really, because guess what? This person still has more apples. The tree is still tilted in their favor. So what do we need to do? We need justice. And this is fixing the system to offer equal access to the tools and the opportunity. Let's straighten the foundation. Let's go back and look at what's wrong with the system. And this picture is the trunk. And let's see how we fix it so that everyone can thrive. So that's the difference between inequality, equality, equity, and justice. So today, we're going to take a trip back in time. We're going to take a trip through history, and we're going to see what happened to our system so that we'll have a better idea of some of the things that need to be fixed. And we'll have a better idea of how we got here so that we can figure out how to clean this up. Okay, are you ready? All righty, let's go on a trip talking about the history of inequities in America. Because to show that there's inequity, but not why there's inequity, it leaves way too much open for interpretation. But the reality is that we live in a racially structured society, and that's what causes inequity. Here I go with my definitions again. So what is race? Do you know race is totally, absolutely made up? It is totally made up because underneath the skin, we are 99% the same. It's a social construct. it's a classification of human beings that's politically defined. So heaven forbid if something happened to me and Lisa was waiting on a heart. When I pass, they're not going to determine if she gets the heart based on race. And she's not going to say, oh, is it a heart from a Black person? Because a heart is a heart. And my heart will beat in anyone's body, different races, that's all made up, remember, body, as long as the blood type and the tissue type and all of that is the same. Underneath the skin, we are 99.8, don't quote me on the 0.8, but more than 99% alike. So why was race even invented? Why did we begin to classify people based on skin color? One, it began with opportunism to hold power and wealth. It's what led to slavery. It resulted in the creation of race to create a wedge between classes in order to justify the institution of slavery. And it's embedded in our practices, our fictitious sciences and policies to hold on to this dehumanizing ideology. So what do I mean by this? It began with opportunism to hold power and wealth. When Africans were brought over from the continent and enslaved, they were not called Black or white, they were Africans. And this third bullet, it resulted in the creation of race to create a wedge between classes. What happened, if you want more information, just Google the Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon spelled like the food, bacon. During this time of slavery, very poor whites and free Black people and even enslaved people, they got together and realized that they were living in a system that was unfair, that the wealthy were exploiting them to get rich. And these poor people all got together to overthrow this rich aristocratic type of climate. And the slave owners found out about it. And the way that they pacified poor whites is elevating them a little bit, but then placing very high value on skin color. You're not like them because you're white. And because you're white, you're better than them. And then they gave them jobs to do, slave patrols, which actually turned out to be over decades, over centuries, the police department, slave patrols, overseers, supervising enslaved people. And before that, race wasn't an issue, but now there was this high value placed on white skin. And you hear people define that sometimes as the institution of whiteness or white supremacy and stuff like that. But that's where it came from. So this is why race was created, and it led to widespread prejudices, racism, and bias. And then I'm going to take you through history with the laws that were put in place to uphold a lot of these practices. And one of the very first laws in this new America was the hereditary law. And it was codified in 1662. Now, before 1662, labor status was not permanent nor solely connected to race. So you could be poor and work your way up, the way that we believe that to be true today. But what the problem with this was that labor status was determined through the father. And this created a serious problem for slave owners because many of the slave owners raped their enslaved African women and had babies. And by virtue of this law, those babies were free because the father was free. And they thought, no, we can't have this. So they changed everything, enacted this hereditary law in 1662 in Virginia, which meant that the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So enslaved women, their children were now, by virtue of this law, enslaved babies. Children of enslaved women automatically shared the legal status of slave. And this doctrine laid the foundation for the natural increase of enslaved people in America. What does that mean? It means that slave owners increased their number of slaves virtually by raping enslaved women because all of their children were now slaves. And it kind of, well, it legitimized the exploitation of female slaves by white planters or other men. So just another poll I just want you to answer in the chat box. Slavery was a long time ago. Is that true or false? What do you think? Okay, JS said false. And you are absolutely right, Lisa, false. This is really false. You know, a lot of people say that was so long ago. Why are we still talking about slavery? Just get over it. But I just want you to see this map. And this map shows the timeline of slavery and segregation in America. Now, 1619 is when Africans were brought over and enslaved, and this red portion shows the 246 years of American slavery. But then look at this yellow here. That's 89 years of segregation and Jim Crow and mass incarcerations and all of that. Again, segregation. And it wasn't until 1954 that we really began to say, okay, maybe we should think about equal rights. This is 1954, I was 5 years old. No, I'm born in 59. I got to get my math right. But I was born 5 years later. My husband was 5 years old. He was actually born in the segregated South and drank from colored water fountains and went to colored bathrooms and had to ride the back of the bus. And when his family went shopping at clothing stores that allowed Black people to shop, they could never, ever try on clothes, ever. It wasn't allowed that Black people couldn't do that. So when we look at this timeline right here, this is a very short period of time where we've been integrated and had civil rights and really began to talk about equality. But I'm going to take you through this whole history through the eyes of a child, and his name is Jamal. And Jamal is 5 years old. His mother is a college professor, and his dad is a corporate lawyer. But Jamal's been suspended from 3 preschools. He's tested, gifted, and talented, and he's disciplined a lot for being too active. And you think, okay, with a mom who's a professor and a dad who's a lawyer, why is this? What's happened? What's going on with this family? Well, let's take a look back. The year is 1670. Jamal's 6th great-grandfather was stolen from East Africa and enslaved in New Orleans, Louisiana. And not long after that, there was a law that was passed. It was the Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. And this allowed an enslaved person to be killed or beaten or whatever if they resisted their master and the master was not held accountable for that. So if an enslaved person resists their master and the master killed him, the master was not held accountable in that person's death. That's 1705. A little later came the Naturalization Act. Now just remember that slavery was huge. They were breeding slaves. You've heard of bucks and those bucks, there were Black men who were strong, were used to rape Black women to produce slaves. Slave owners were raping Black women. The Institute of Slavery was multiplying more and more and more and more slaves. And at the same time, people looked around and thought, we have a lot of Black people right now. We really need more white people, and we need to set up a system to invite them here and keep them here. So this is the Naturalization Act of 1790, and it was the act that determined citizenship. So it set the criteria for naturalization for 2 years of residency, proof of good moral character, and an oath to support the Constitution. And it gave white immigrants citizenship and the right to vote and vast political power. But during this time, there were 3 generations of Jamal's ancestors who were still enslaved, and they could be killed if they learned to read or write. And they were counted as property and suffered the atrocities of slavery. You see these welts, they were whipped and maimed, and if they ran away, to have their feet chopped off. They were sold from their families, their children. I mean, it was really one of the worst institutions in our history. But then they had this idea, these laws around voting and representation in Congress. And slave-holding states said, well, we want to count our slaves. And northern states said, no, your slaves are property. That's how you count them. And the slaveholding states said, well, no, because that's not fair, because then you'll have more representation in Congress than we will if we don't count them. So what they did, they took their property and they negotiated and decided that an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. So not really a person, but 3/5 of a person. And during that same time, other things were happening. Other laws were being codified and promulgated. So in 1830, they had to remove the indigenous people. They had to make room for the white immigrants who were coming over, who would be naturalized. So they signed into law a law authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing border states. So they basically took the land from the indigenous people. And at the same time, they were thinking about how can we now expand our slave territory? And this is what led to the Treaty of Guadalupe 18 years later in 1848. It ended the war between US and Mexico. And in Mexico, we said ceded, but historians say that a lot of their land was stolen. And the land included present day Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. And then most of the language, most of the agreements for that treaty were broken, and Americans were deported from their own land. And this is, a lot of people talk about the broken promises of this treaty. And many times you'll hear Mexican people say, we're not crossing the border crossed us. So you may have people right there in your county whose family has been there for generations before Colorado was ever a state. So just be aware of that. So that happened in 1848. And shortly after, there was this Homestead Act that was passed. Now, the Homestead Act is really interesting when you think about the, let me go back here. When you think about the Naturalization Act and the Homestead Act and how they kind of work together, because you could be naturalized 2 years, remember, in good moral character, but by this time, they needed people to come and stay. So recruiting white immigrants was huge. And the Homestead Act granted 160 acres of federal land to any US citizen, but it was free if that person lived on the land for 5 years and improved the land by building a home or producing a crop. And this legislation was intended to incentivize people to settle on the Western frontier and aid the continuing territorial expansion of the United States. So free land, 160 acres. There are 2 factors that lead to wealth in our country: land ownership and education. So this was huge. But meanwhile, Jamal's ancestors couldn't take advantage. They were still enslaved. And we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Treaty of Guadalupe, which promised Mexicans living on their land that they would become citizens, but that didn't really happen. So what happened was, by the end of this act, more than 270 million acres of indigenous land was transferred to individuals, and almost all of them were white. And then came the 13th Amendment. Jamal's fourth great-grandfather was freed from slavery. But was he really free? Now, the 13th Amendment banned slavery and all involuntary servitude except in the commission of a crime. Now, I want you to reflect on this. Were those formerly enslaved people in a position to live as free people? What were some of the barriers they faced? What supports were provided and what supports did they need? And what about slave owners? Almost overnight, they lost their labor force. So who would provide the labor? Who would pick that cotton? Who would do whatever you do to sugarcane? That was another crop. Who would take care of the house and the children and the fields? And how did this impact them? So I just want you to reflect, and anything you'd like to share, please feel free to share it in the text, in the chat box. So were these formerly enslaved people in a position to live as free people? No. JS says no. They had no education. Remember, it was against the law for them to read and write. They had no education. They had no property. They owned nothing. They owned nothing. So it says, how can you live free without money or education? Absolutely. Very, very interesting. And where would you live? They own nothing. They have always been on the plantations. So where would they live? How would they live? They couldn't read or write. Absolutely. Let's go back to this slide. Was he really free? Remember when I asked you, what about the slave owner? How were they going to manage? What if you had 200 slaves and crops of cotton to be picked? What will happen now? But remember this exception, except in the case of punishment for a crime. I'm going to step off topic for a second. I have to tell you, I'm seriously proud that Colorado banned this exception from its constitution. And it was my son actually who led the fight for that initiative. So I'm a proud mama for that. So except for punishment for a crime, but what was considered a crime? Now, all of a sudden, land needed to be tended to. Black people were free. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't read or write. White slave owners needed this free labor. So Black codes were created to regulate the behavior, activities, and freedoms of these freed Black people. They were essentially re-enslaved through these Black codes. There were forced labor contracts. Black codes included crimes like vagrancy, standing on a street corner too long. And if parents were arrested for vagrancy, then their children were forced into labor by calling them apprentices. Let me show you a little clip on that.
In November and December 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, Southern states sought to control their large populations of newly freed Black people. Laws were passed authorizing the arrest and jailing of Blacks. These laws became known as Black Codes. They typically applied only to Blacks and criminalized acts that were not offenses when committed by whites. On November 24, 1865, Mississippi passed a Black Code declaring that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes found without proof of employment or found unlawfully assembling themselves would owe up to $50 in fines and serve up to 10 days in jail. As a result of Black codes, The post-Civil War era brought American Black citizens more contact with the criminal courts and prison systems than ever before. As the former Confederacy learned to use the criminal justice system as a tool of racial control, countless Black men, women, and children were convicted and sentenced under unjust laws that criminalized them for existing as free Black citizens.
And that's how Black codes were used to re-enslave Black people. And throughout that period came sharecropping. So Jamal's third great-grandfather became a sharecropper. And many former enslaved people became trapped in this system. So those who weren't jailed and forced into labor, they ended up in this cycle of poverty and sharecropping. They called it economic exploitation. And this was the beginning of the wealth gap. It made it impossible to generate and pass down wealth. And the way it worked is that the owners would hire these hands, field hands, to work their land. And they supposedly paid them. Now remember, these people couldn't read or write, do math or any of that. So these sharecroppers would work all year. And at the end of the year, they would square up their accounts. And every year, at the end of the year, the sharecropper would end up owing more money because the owner would take out for food, for materials, for their clothing, all of that. And remember, these people couldn't read, write, or do math, so they didn't know that they were being exploited. So sharecroppers owned nothing but their labor. They were left with no cash and in perpetual debt, and they could never leave because it would have been illegal for them to leave. So there were generations of sharecroppers, and actually my family were sharecroppers. And the furniture in my living room was actually given to my great-great-grandmother by the lady in the big house when she got new furniture. She gave it to my great-great-grandmother, and I still have it to this day. Not long after that, so after this came the Reconstruction period. Black people began to do well. We had the most Black members of Congress than we've ever had since that time. But then people didn't like that. So we had this compromise of 1877. And after the Civil War, there were protections put in place that protected the rights of newly freed enslaved people. But the compromise of 1877 allowed all the protections that were put in place to be rescinded. So there was nothing to protect these Black people, especially in the South. The federal troops were withdrawn, and many Southern whites resorted to intimidation and violence to keep Blacks from voting and to restore white supremacy in the nation. And this is when Jim Crow was established. We saw the lynching everywhere, a lot of fear. This was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all of that. By this time, Jamal's second great-grandfather fled the South. He fled the terror. I know in school we learned about this as the Great Migration, but it was fleeing terror for many Black people in the South. This was from 1910 to 1940. But also in the middle of this came the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was bad for white people. So if it was bad for white people, you could imagine what it was like for Black people. Uneducated, fleeing the South, many of them fleeing the sharecroppers, so thought to be escaping illegally. I mean, it was just a mess, and it worsened the already bleak economic status of African Americans because they were the first to be laid off from jobs. The unemployment rate was 2 to 3 times that of whites. African Americans received substantially less aid. Many of the charitable organizations never even considered giving aid to Black people. They were excluded from soup kitchens. And even when the New Deal was put into place, the Recovery Act from 1933 to 34, it excluded Blacks from unions. And Blacks were either excluded or forced to organize in separate unions. And one of the most popular is the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So when Black workers tried to organize themselves into their own unions, they became targets of lynch mobs in the North and the South. And part of this was New Deal was also Social Security. And I don't know if you all know how difficult it was to get Social Security into legislation. And one of the biggest compromises for this was excluding Black people. They did not want Blacks to benefit from Social Security. But by this time, you couldn't put that race into law. But what they did, they excluded agricultural and domestic workers. So a large percentage of those were Black. So that's how they excluded them. And it wasn't until the mid to late 1950s that those groups were reinstated, included in the Social Security Act. But by this time, you know, where people are coming from the war, Black people did fight in the war. And after returning, Jamal's great-grandfather, Joe, he wanted to use one of the greatest benefits to veterans, and that's the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, I don't know if any of you have used it or have families that use it. I mean, wonderful for buying a house and for going to school. So Joe, Jamal's great-grandfather, was very excited to leave the war and be able to use his GI Bill so that he could move up in society. He really wanted to move to this newly developed suburb in his hometown. But then the covenants, the racist covenants, did not allow it. It wasn't open to Blacks. I want you to do a little homework. You know, that's the teacher in me again. Look at Google covenants, racial covenants for your own county, for your own housing development, and see if you can find any. We found some here in Highlands Ranch, and it was amazing to see, kind of scary. So this GI Bill allowed white veterans to prosper and do well and accumulate wealth, but it did not deliver on its promise for Blacks. This is a contributing factor, one of the greatest factors in driving the wealth gap and the education gap, because people were denied this bill. And if many of you talk to your parents or your grandparents, especially those who are veterans, you can see and talk to them and hear their stories about how they were able to buy homes and great neighborhoods and build wealth from those homes. And many of them were able to use their GI Bills for education. Now, the GI Bill didn't specifically exclude African Americans from its benefits, but there was a fight to take it away from federal control to state control. And once the states could set the criteria for it, that's where we saw a lot of the racism. And some of the inequities in the administration of the GI Bill were like segregated schools. So although they could go to school and have their tuition paid for, many of the schools were segregated. The vocational programs, such as plumbing and electricians, they didn't have the adequate equipment, so they couldn't be certified as plumbers or electricians. And then some people were just terrified of being lynched. My great uncles, I had two of them who were lynched, and their names are in the lynching museum that's in Alabama. Actually, my son found it, which was amazing because we heard rumors they were lynched, but we never had proof until my son visited the museum and found their names. And then the inequitable implementation of unemployment benefits. And then one of the greatest contributing factor in terms of wealth gap, redlining. How does redlining work? It's a decades-old practice of marking maps by race to characterize the risk of lending money and providing insurance. It made purchasing a home even more difficult for these Black veterans. Lenders froze out poor neighborhoods, ensuring that loan assistance and mortgage would be denied, while the new white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants that denied entry to Black people. Let's take a peek.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately,
Think about that a little bit. I want to take you back to this part where I might not be able to find it, but where low income white families have a much better chance of securing a loan than high income Black families. That actually happened to us. My family, we understand how wealth is generated. And we decided that we would save, work hard, and 2 years after our children graduated from college, that we would help them buy a home. Our children are 12 years apart. So when we went to buy my daughter's home, we were building. So we put our $2,000 earnest money down, and we waited, the house was being built, and then they offered us a loan. And this was during the time of subprime loans. You remember those awful loans that they were giving people, and they offered us a subprime loan. And we're like, no way on earth, we're not gonna take that. And they said, well, you have to, and if you refuse, then you're gonna lose your earnest money because you have to accept the loan we offer. We're like, well, no. And finally I asked the guy, would you advise your daughter to have a loan like this? He goes, that's not the question. And we said no. And we knew instinctively that it would be much easier for us to lose that $2,000 than for her to be in such a horrible loan. And of course, we were able to go through another company. We went through a credit union and got her a wonderful fixed 30-year loan. And then fast forward 14 years later, when we got ready to buy my son a home just 3 years ago, for all three of us, our credit scores were over 800. We had enough money in the bank to buy the house outright, but yet we were denied by 2 banks. And there were ridiculous reasons. One said they didn't like the way that our HR person verified our employment. And the other just outright said, we can't make sense of your income, so we're denying this. It was just ridiculous. By the time I got a broker, and we were just asked for unnecessary documentation. And finally the broker said, you might want to Google her before you continue to ask for the same documentation for the 3rd time. This doesn't feel fair. I've had, dozens of clients. This has never happened. And you may not want this fight on your hands. And that's how they ended up approving the loan. But these practices are still alive and well. And Alex says, do you think that redlining is still being actively practiced today? Yes, yes, it is. It's not called redlining, but it is the discrimination of people of color, like what happened to me, who cannot get loans. It is also the undervaluing of homes that's now led to mass gentrification, the undervaluing of homes, and then people coming in, purchasing the homes for a little of nothing, and then home values increasing. So it's still being practiced, but just in a different way. Very, very good question. So fast forward now to Joe's grandfather. He ended up buying an overpriced home in a low-income neighborhood, and the interest rate was very high. And in the area where he bought a home, there were environmental issues, physical conditions like heat, cold, energy efficiency, ventilation, chemical conditions such as carbon monoxide, secondhand smoke, lead, biological conditions such as rodents, house mites, roaches, humidity, and mold, and then the social conditions related to mental health because of all of the other ills of society that happens in some of these low-income areas. And as a result, Jamal's grandfather had health issues. He was diabetic, he was overweight, had high blood pressure, and it was really hard for him. But he still raised his son to value education. And he taught his son that education was the way out of poverty. So Jamal's father graduated from law school, but he had $200,000 in student loans. He had to help take care of his parents because his dad wasn't able to keep a job because of his health. And he had no money to buy a home for his family. And he was often feared by his coworkers and stopped by the police on a regular basis, which caused a lot of stress. And I just want to say that we tell people all the time that education is the key out of poverty. But someone like Jamal's father, in an effort to escape poverty, actually ends up in poverty because of the cost of college and student loans. So they take out these student loans to go to school to better themselves, and then end up owing more in student loans than it would cost to buy a home. So keep that in mind as well. And then Jamal's mother, she suffered from racial trauma. She's a dark woman, and she suffered from colorism. How many of you have heard the term colorism? And colorism is, it impacts all communities of color. And it's this belief that the darker you are, the less desirable you are. And the closer to white, the better. And even children used to jump rope to a song, if you're black, get back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're white, you're all right. And this stratification is true in Asian communities, and Latinx communities, and in Black communities. So colorism is real. And then the microaggressions and code switching. Code switching is, it's the ability to shift who you are to fit in. So for me, the way that I code switched when I worked for state government is I straightened my hair, and I wore smaller earrings, and I always dressed very conservatively and didn't wear loud colors because I didn't want to be considered too ethnic. I watched the way I talked. Now, in my family, I grew up speaking African-American vernacular English. So my grandmother would say, hey, baby, did you eat yet? And I say, yeah, Granny, I done ate. But I knew that I couldn't go to school and say, I done ate. I had to say, yes, ma'am, I've eaten. So that's code switching. You see it in communities where we have dual language learners, where they won't speak their language in public or at school. So that code switching, and it could be very, very stressful. And then she had health issues. She had gestational diabetes, preeclampsia. She could have died in childbirth. And she was 3 days in ICU following Jamal's birth. Black women are 4 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than Black women. But after all of that, they had a blessing of this baby boy. but he was born 4 weeks early. He had low birth weight and he was in NICU for 2 days. So I want you to know that what Jamal is impacted, not only by what's happening today, but by everything that has happened over years and generations is in his DNA. So he had a tough upbringing. In spite of his family trying to do well, all of the struggles, his mother suffered from postpartum depression. His parents ended up separating for 6 months. His grandfather contracted COVID and moved in with the family. By this time, he was a heavy drinker, and he often cussed at and humiliated Jamal. And this could be why he's acting out in school. He's acting out, even though he's brilliant boy, gifted and talented, and he's active. He can't be still. So you may be wondering, let's going back to where we started. Why are we talking about race? It's not only about race, Rosemarie, and I hear that a lot. And that's absolutely correct. It's not only about race, but it is always about race. And what does that mean? No matter how you look at the data in this country, Black and brown children on every single indicator of child well-being are at the very, very bottom. Very bottom. So we can't fix this problem unless we're really worried about and willing to talk about race and racism, as uncomfortable as it is. And like I said, we didn't create this problem, we inherited this problem, but we do have the power to do something about it. So as we begin to close, I just want to talk about, and you could put things in the chat box, what you learned. Was there anything new that resonated with you, or was it an aha, or I didn't know that? And what can you do with this information from here? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see my face. And let's just put in the chat box what you think, what you learned,